I don't think the Prime Minister will get through, one way or the other. I don't think he'll get through to the autumn. And this policy just doesn't seem to be even timed, therefore, for a general election correctly either. So it's everything about this policy, the deterrent effect, the timings, the cost of the policy. I think Rishi Sunak's taken some brave decisions as Prime Minister. He cancelled HS2. It was one of the bravest decisions. I bet Labour will not reverse this because we put so much money into that policy, and it was very brave to say, well, I'm not going to spend any more. But it was a brave decision, but I just regret that he didn't say the same about Rwanda. Yeah. He should have said it's too expensive and I'm going to abandon it.
Well, I think every time that the Labour Party and what you might call the Liberal elite in the House of Lords opposes to this, it's a win for the government because it makes them look as if they're doing something, and it also makes Labour and its allies look as if they're obstructing something which an awful lot of people would like to see happen. I mean, it's not that people particularly want anyone to be sent to Rwanda, but they do want the borders of the country to be properly defended and properly sealed against illegal entry. And I think anybody who spends an awful lot of time making a huge effort to stop any measure which might conceivably make the borders more secure is probably doing himself no good.
Yeah, I think you've got to ask what the intention is behind this policy. And I think there are now so many things that Rwanda has become for the Tory party that it will never satisfy most of them. That's the reality here. The first is, will it act as a deterrent? Well, Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, but when Boris Johnson was in charge, of course, we understand, raised his own concerns. The fact that you would only ever be able to send a small number of people to Rwanda, the fact that people have already taken pretty risky decisions to make it here in the first place, and the cost, Rishi Sunak as Chancellor suggested, would make it, not a decent policy to pursue. He now believes it will work as a deterrent, partly because the government has enacted a policy with Albania to send people back to Albania, and he says that's an example of how a deterrent can work because the number of Albanians crossing in small boats is now much, much smaller. There is an argument to say that in theory it works, but in reality, Albania is a different country and everybody is coming from Albania. Not everybody is coming from the same place in small boats.
If people are willing to, at a very basic level, of course we've said this almost so many times, John, as you know, but at a very basic level, if someone is willing to cross the busiest shipping lane in the world to get to Britain, they are already making a big gamble. Yeah. And even if this policy gets through the courts, gets through the Lords today, all the rest of it, hundreds will go to Rwanda at most. That's a very small percentage of the tens of thousands who come, probably still planning to come. Yes. So the deterrent effect just doesn't make sense to me. And so day after day, week after week, John Pienaar programme after John Pienaar programme, we talk about this because the Prime Minister's put it on the map to such an extent. This is time that could be spent addressing the crime problem. Yeah. It could be addressing the NHS, could be addressing the fact we have a sluggish economy. I do not get that this policy will have its desired effect.
I think the key thing is on that podium at his press conference, he's got the words stop the boats. He hasn't got the words pass the Rwanda Bill or get the flights off to Rwanda. So the key question is, does this policy stop the boats? And if you look at the numbers of people they're planning to send to Rwanda, nobody quite knows how many it is, but at one point they were talking about 1,000 people over the first few years, not even, multiple hundreds of people.
I think actually probably lower than that. Matt Dathan has, talked about it being 150 people they'd identified as being.
So that is not going to stop the boats because it isn't a proper deterrent. If you think you're already willing to risk your life to come across the channel on this dangerous boat, if you think there's a small chance you might possibly get deported to Rwanda, it's not going to really act as a deterrent. So I think there's a sort of slight danger of missing the wood for the trees in all of this. And actually, what's the purpose of this policy and is it going to achieve that is what really matters.
The idea that it would have this massive impact, I think, is unlikely. The government are kind of tied to it because it's been their sort of flagship policy for so long. But a bit like, their national insurance cut, they do it once, it doesn't make a difference to the polls. They've done it a second time, it hasn't made a difference. I'm not sure this is going to have the kind of the poll bounce that they're really hoping for either.
I don't know, but yes, if looking at it just politically, he does sound as if he's gritting his teeth and trying to say something very, very strong and definite.
But imagine that the view in the government, and I'm not a supporter of theirs, is that the more that the left in general oppose this measure, the better it is for them. it's not as if they've done very much about migration, legal or illegal, for the past 15 years or so, or how long it's been. But it does make it look as if they're doing something, as if their opponents want to stop it.
I suppose he had to say something firm now, just to give any credibility to the whole thing at all. But it's desperate. It's a desperate thing to watch. There is, as Rachel will be telling us, I hope, about the Commission. I mean, there's so much else that we and the Home Office should be thinking about.
For the government, the problem is that the people who really want the Rwanda planes to take off, or really want to see the planes taking off, are potentially people who are already within the tent. Whether this is going to start bringing over voters who have switched to Labour, I think it's hard to judge, really. And I think also the fact is that even if they got planes going in, the PM sounded quite optimistic about getting them perhaps in July, and a schedule of planes, ahead of perhaps an election in the autumn. That would still only be a few hundred, perhaps into the thousands. The total people who arrived in small boats last year was around 30,000. The year before that, it was 45,000. We're on for a record figure potentially this year, especially if we now have quite a warm summer.
It would have to be quite massive. The word would have to be getting around all across Europe and across northern France. There's no point in the boats. You always end up on a plane to Rwanda. And that means big numbers. And I don't see the big numbers happening anytime soon.
And actually, the thing that Matt Dathan, the Home Affairs editor of the Times, was saying, that actually so many people have come, anyone who goes on the plane, I've just been in early July, will be people who arrived a year, maybe 2 years ago. In terms of, it's not people who, with record numbers we've seen since the beginning of the year. So it's just a question, does that act as enough of a deterrent if you're standing on the shoreline in Calais? Libby, do you think that if a flight takes off with people on it for this policy, which everyone said would never take off, will he get any credit for that?
I don't know. I suppose he might, but it's all getting so close to the next election. I don't think he will.
When you talk about Rwanda, it often gets tied up in a conversation about how talking about immigration is wrong in some way. It's a bad thing to talk about, oh, you must be a bigot, or you just don't want anyone else in the country, you want to lock everything down. And when those things get tied together, it becomes really, really difficult to solve that problem, because everybody takes sides and you can't get through it. What actually needs to happen in this debate is a bit of honesty and a bit of levelling with the country. And actually, when you look at some of the more in-depth polling about immigration, when you say to people, would you like more nurses from abroad? People say, yeah. Would you like more teachers? Yeah, that sounds great. Happy with that. People are not anti-immigration. They just don't want it to feel like it's not fair, which is where the Rwanda policy comes from. But it doesn't necessarily solve the fundamental problems that more immigration brings with it. I think the bigger question is, for the Tory party and for the Prime Minister, Rwanda has become, the saving grace. It's become the way to win the election. It's become the way to stick it to Labour. It's become the way to quiet the right wing of the Tory party. And it just doesn't really do any of those things. No. And that's the biggest political problem with it as a policy. Because if you keep talking about it, even when you deliver the flights, if people at home don't feel any different because they still can't get a GP appointment, they still can't get their kid into the right school, and they may well blame those things on immigration. It might not be the fault of immigration, but they might blame it on immigration. Then this policy doesn't answer that question, and nor does it really answer the others either. No. So it's a really, it's a difficult one.
The Conservative right-wingers are standing by ready to turn this into an issue about Rishi Sunak's leadership and whether he's got the guts in their mind to deal with the ECHR, European Court of Human Rights. So that will become the new kind of right-wing totem, if you like, as a test of his credibility.
When the Prime Minister said today that courts won't stop this policy, I thought, are you sure? What if the courts stop it? Is that actually what Rishi Sunak wants?
Well, that's the right wing.
Yeah. Does he then want to say, I've done everything, I've moved heaven and earth to get this policy over the line. The only way we can get control of our borders, not just Rwanda, but generally, is to leave the ECHR. And suddenly it's not Rwanda that is the policy that's on the electoral agenda, it's the ECHR.